So is Valentine's Day, a great day to talk about our heart. Not talking about our blood pumper. Any day's a good day to talk about that, get it checked. Also not talking about our heart toward our Valentine or any of our loved ones. Valentine's Day, also a great day, maybe the best day to talk about our heart for those people we love. But today we're talking about our heart in a different way. A way that I think is really important. And as we're continuing to study the journey of the nation of Israel, their exodus, they're going to help us to evaluate our heart. Now, last week we studied Exodus chapter 19, and we left the nation of Israel and camped at the foot of Mount Sinai. They've consecrated themselves by putting on clean clothing. It was a symbolic act to show that they were declaring their commitment to God. And in the process, they agreed to bind themselves in covenant with God. That means they were saying that they would follow His words and His ways. But what are His words and His ways? He hasn't really told them a whole lot just yet. Well, in Exodus chapter 20, that all changes. God begins to describe very clearly His words and His ways to Israel. In fact, Exodus 20 is a monumental chapter of the Bible. I Googled it. Google most important chapters of the Bible, and almost certainly you're going to find that every list includes Exodus chapter 20. Why? Well, it's a good reason. Exodus chapter 20 includes the 10 Commandments. We're going to begin slowing down a bit now that we've arrived at the 10 Commandments. Basically, we're going to look at one commandment per week until we finish them all. But we're going to get to the first one today. And before we do, I wanted us to get a wider scope of what the 10 Commandments are and their significance. So let's think about the 10 Commandments. They're also known as the Decalogue. That's a title that comes from the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And that ancient Greek translation is called the Septuagint. In fact, if you look at Exodus chapter 34, verse 28, in the Greek, you'll see that word Decalogue. That verse depicts God inscribing the 10 Commandments. Really specifically, it means 10 words. And God, as we see in Exodus chapter 20, verse 1, He spoke words. That's what it says. God speaks and declares His word. It's His way of declaring His heart and what He loves and what He wishes, what He desires for His people. God's word is what is true and beautiful and good. God's word leads to flourishing, which is this broad, wide-ranging concept that is pretty much the same as the Hebrew word shalom. Now, typically, when we hear that Hebrew word shalom, we think of peace. And it does mean peace, but it is this expansive concept of wholeness, of rightness in relationship between humans and God, humans and each other, and all the world. And so God's words declare that shalom looks like and is how people will live when they follow God's words. So, in Exodus chapter 20, we're going to read God's 10 words. These are words which form a significant part of the foundation of this covenant that He has between Himself and His people, Israel. These 10 words, however, are not the only foundation of that covenant. Do you remember that time when Jesus was questioned by one of the teachers of the law in His day? What is the greatest command in the law? And you'd think that He could just answer that real easy and go to commandment number 1, which we're going to be talking about today. It's like the foundation of the 10 Commandments. It seems to be the most important, but Jesus doesn't do that. Instead, He goes to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and recites a few words from Israel's great Shema. And the words that Jesus says are, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's a good answer. And I think many people in the crowd that day, including the teacher of the law, might have been nodding their heads, and yet they also might have been a bit surprised, like, why didn't he go to the 10 Commandments, especially commandment number 1? But then Jesus really shocked them when he said that his second most important command was this obscure choice from deep down within the law. Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself. Wouldn't you think that when asked what the greatest command is, that Jesus should have picked one of the 10 Commandments for at least one of the top 2? Instead, he says that all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 other commands, loving God and loving neighbor. And so in this, Jesus is giving us a healthy reminder that we need to be circumspect about how much importance we place on the 10 Commandments. I think there's another reason why we need to put the 10 Commandments in proper perspective, and that is this whole idea of covenant. I've already said it. The 10 Commandments are part of the foundation of God's covenant with his people Israel. And that covenant is sometimes referred to as the Mosaic covenant, the Mosaic law. Sometimes we Christians will call it the Old Covenant. Well, remember last week in Exodus chapter 19, there's Moses. He's the leader of the nation. He goes up Mount Sinai to meet with God and actually to receive this law. But that covenant that Moses receives was not the first covenant in the Bible. In fact, in the narrative of the book of Genesis, God makes covenants with a couple people. Probably the most famous one that it is because of Noah and the flood and the rainbow. It was the indication that God was going to keep his promise, keep his covenant with his people. But the covenant that God makes with Abraham in the book of Genesis, I think, is more important than that. Here's what God says to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. The Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. So that launched Abram into this journey. And as we fast forward through his life and then into the lives of his son Isaac, grandson Jacob, Jacob's son Joseph, and all through the 400 plus years of slavery that Israel had in Egypt, we see that God kept his covenant. In fact, we see it right before us here in Exodus chapter 20. Abraham's family did become a great nation. There they are at Mount Sinai, a nation. Now God, meeting with Moses, if we were maybe to use a little bit of a contemporary word, is re-upping that same covenant. This Mosaic covenant that we're about to begin learning all the details of here in Exodus chapter 20 is not entirely new. Maybe you could say it's version 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, it depends how you look at it. It's a new edition of an old covenant. It's for a different people who are now at a different time. Israel is now a nation. The 12 tribes total more than 1 million people. They've lived in slavery for over 400 years. So they comprise a demographic that is vastly different than those nomadic families of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Especially because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their families did not have a slavery identity. So the ramification of this social dynamic is significant. It's that God, through this Mosaic covenant, is going to spell out in excruciating detail how this nation of formerly enslaved peoples should worship him, should live together, should dwell among all the nations of the earth, so that they might all experience God's shalom. Therefore, the heart of the Mosaic covenant is identical to the Abrahamic covenant. God's desire is for his people to be a blessing to the whole world. God's chosen people, Israel, are not his people to the exclusion of all the others. I mean, we learned this last week in chapter 19. God's chosen people are to be priests who help others connect with God. And the Mosaic covenant will guide them on that important mission. So, with that said, we can see how unique this Mosaic covenant is. It's a special agreement between God and this ancient nation, a family who's become a nation. That means this: the Mosaic covenant is only for the nation of Israel, the ancient nation of Israel. God didn't have a covenant with Egypt or Assyria or Babylon or any other nation that would come along. Not even the contemporary nation of Israel. In fact, as we're going to see, God's covenant with Israel will include some warnings describing how Israel can actually break this covenant to the point where it becomes null and void. Now, in our midweek studies over the last couple years, we were previously looking at the book of Jeremiah, and at Faith Church Sunday mornings a couple years ago, we looked at the prophet Ezekiel. These were both deeply painful studies of how the nation of Israel did in fact break the covenant with God in the centuries to come. They repeatedly turned their backs on God. They worshiped false gods. They disobeyed the covenant, and God declared the covenant was broken. But then he made a promise. And we saw this in those prophetic books. A promise of a new covenant to come. And God followed through in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. You know, when we Christians take communion, we reflect on Jesus' words at the Last Supper he had with his disciples. Not only that, he took the bread and broke it and said, "This is my body broken for you." And then he took the cup. And he said, "This is my blood shed for you, the new covenant." God was establishing the new covenant through Jesus. Now, we Christians call it, therefore, the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Very similar to our Old Testament and New Testament. In fact, if you want to look more at the significance and beauty of the New Covenant, I encourage you to read Hebrews chapters 8 and 9. But I want to mention this idea that the Old Covenant can be nullified and that the New Covenant is established because it is very clear that you and I, and I'm speaking as Christians to Christians, the church, we are not under the Old Covenant. That was exclusively for the nation of Israel. God no longer has a covenant with any geographical or biological people. Instead, God's new covenant is with the church, all those who are in Christ. And that means Christians are not bound to the terms of the Old Covenant. Not a single word of the Old Covenant applies to us. Jesus fulfilled the Old Covenant and set us free to enter into new covenant with God. And that's what we're bound to. We're bound to the terms of the New Covenant, which we read about in the New Testament. Therefore, the Ten Commandments, as terms of the Old Covenant, are not for us. Now, that might sound like a shocking statement, especially given the fact that, at least here in the United States, we have this history of inscribing the words of the Ten Commandments in places like courthouses and public squares, that kind of a thing. And we might think, wait a minute. Aren't the Ten Commandments a theological, moral foundation that apply to every living person? I mean, don't the Ten Commandments just describe what is right and what is wrong? What I'm suggesting is that we need to have a more nuanced view of this situation than just simply saying that the Ten Commandments are binding for everyone. We need that more nuanced view because as Christians, we are not bound to the terms of the Old Covenant. We're bound to the New Covenant. But here's the twist. We can benefit, significantly benefit, from every single law in the Old Covenant. I learned this from my Old Testament professor, David Dorsey, and he recommended that we take 3 steps as Christians when we approach the Mosaic Law. Step number 1, remember, this law is not my law. It was for the ancient nation of Israel, not me. It's not for the church. Step 2, discern what that law meant to those original Israelites. How did it speak to their reality, their culture? I know we can't determine that at 100% for every single law, but we can try, and we can do really well. For the classic example is the parapet law. One of the laws God said to the nation of Israel, build parapets or fences around your rooftops, because they were generally living on flat roofs. Why? Well, God didn't want people, especially children, to fall off the roof and get hurt. What does that show us? Step 3, God's heart. What is God's heart in the law? We can apply God's heart to our lives as well, many ways. In the parapet law, God cares for human life and safety. So wear your seatbelt. Take precautions in all sorts of situations because God values life. And so we can work those 3 steps with each of the 10 commandments. We can do it with all the 600 plus laws in the Mosaic Law, and we can properly apply them to our lives. Also, 9 of the 10 commandments are repeated or re-upped in the New Covenant, in the New Testament. Just 1 is not. Number 4, honor the Sabbath. And we're going to get to that in a few weeks. We're going to talk about how we as Christians can interact with this idea of Sabbath. So let's take a look at the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. Why is God concerned about other gods? I mean, there are no other gods. What's he talking about? There's not any competition here. Why is he even saying this? Why doesn't he just say, I'm the only God, worship me, period? Well, God refers to other gods because many of the Israelites would have believed that there were other gods. They had been living in Israel or in Egypt all their lives, and the Egyptians had plenty of gods. The nations all around them, the Canaanites, all had various gods, the Philistines and so on. There were temples and altars and high places and priests and prophets for multitudes of gods everywhere they went. So, Israel would need to be convinced that their God, Yahweh, was the one true God. And so commandment number 1, or word number 1, is this clarion call for a new monotheism in which Israel is to situate Yahweh, their God, as the one true God of their hearts. They are to think only on Him. They are to give allegiance only to Him. Now, sadly, Israel is going to wrestle with this for a long time. There's always going to be a temptation that they battle to worship other gods. It's almost constant for the rest of their nation's history. But what about us? Do we struggle with other gods? Now, generally speaking, evangelical Christians are monotheists. We believe in one God, the triune God, Father, Son, Spirit. We do not believe that's 3 gods. We believe that's one God who exists in 3 persons totally equal. And we know there are other religions who claim that there are other gods, but we evangelicals, I think most of us would deem them to be not true. False religions, false gods. We do believe in lesser beings, angels, but we believe they're created beings, that God created them and they pale in comparison to the power of God, whether demons or angels. We also do not believe that humans can become gods. And yet I would still suggest that we can treat other humans or possessions or sometimes ideas in a God-like kind of way. Have you ever heard the saying, that person, money is their God? Security can be our God, safety, our nation, our national ideas, a politician, a celebrity. There are plenty of things that we can give our allegiance to. Sometimes we have a mixture where we have divided allegiances. We might favor one more than the other, but there are many times, if we would examine our hearts, that God does not have our whole heart. We can readily pledge allegiance to a country, sing its national anthem, maybe get a little bit emotional and misty-eyed when the anthem comes to that rousing conclusion. And yet, how does that compare to our heart passion for Jesus and his kingdom and the mission of his kingdom? Now, I suspect that none of us would publicly admit, I have placed other gods before the one true God. And yet, is it possible that we've actually done so? The first commandment reminds us to place God at that priority. Not because he's selfish or arrogant, but because it will be in our best interests to worship him and him only. And so I encourage you to examine your heart on this Valentine's Day. How much allegiance, how much heart does God have?